All right, guys. This is the last day of our first week of online schooling. I hope you're doing well out there. I'm feeling good. Ready for week two. Glad that you guys are out there reading some Hemingway. Hopefully, read it. It's not hard to read. They're pretty short stories, pretty fast, and they're weird and interesting, kind of. Hills Like White Elephants. You should be watching this after you've read it and after you've completed the homework. That way, uh, this will all make sense, but I do want to analyze the story a little bit. We'll talk about these weird symbols I was having you write about in the homework for Hills Like White Elephants, as well as discussing the meaning behind the subtext of what they were talking about. Also, we'll talk about how all this, again, shows elements of Ernest Hemingway's writing style. He's very famous for his style, the way he writes. So, and he worked very hard at it. Even if it seems really simple, he was a technician. He was trying very hard to develop a very specific kind of meticulous style. So let's talk about Hills Like White Elephants. So first thing is what I asked you to kind of get a preview of from my last video, the one on Soldiers Home. I revealed that this topic that the couple is talking about in Hills Like White Elephants, although it's never mentioned directly, we're supposed to kind of figure it out, even though it's really not that easy to do that. But almost everybody agrees that what they're talking about is abortion. And how would you know that? How would we figure it out? Well, by looking at some of these symbols and seeing what the kind of suggested topics that need to be considered here, we see how this is a pretty good answer. All right, I'm going to lead you through the story a little bit. So let's go through those symbols first. So if we're thinking about this topic of abortion, how does this help us interpret these specific symbols I asked you about? Well, I'm going to take a look at my text here on my computer. Let's start out. Let's see, what did I have you do first? First one I had you look at was the train station. Well, there's a couple different things we can say about the train station without even looking at the text. It's obviously representative of a decision, right? A place of decision. Are you going to get on the train? Or are you going to get off the train? Or which way are you going to go? Because we do have a couple times in the stories where the characters look at the two different sides of the train station. And if you know train stations, if you go on one side of the train station, the train's going that way. You go on the other side of the train station, the train's going that way. So which way are they going to go? What it suggests is that this couple is at a place of decision, having to decide which direction they're going to go regarding this choice they must make. So that kind of gives us the fact that we're dealing with a choice. We kind of know that because the main guy is trying to kind of convince her to do something. He says he doesn't care, but he sure seems to be pushing in one direction. And let's see kind of what is suggested by these other symbols as well. So the next one is the hills as white elephants. This one's always kind of funny. There's a lot of things people want to guess that I just don't know if are correct. A big one is there's such a thing as a white elephant party, where you are giving someone a gift they don't really want. That could kind of fit here, but I don't have any reason to believe that a white elephant party was a thing back then in the 1920s. So I don't usually think of that as the specific meaning. Then people often talk about the idea of the elephant in the room. If you've heard that term before, it means like the thing nobody wants to talk about, but it's obviously on everyone's mind. That's extremely relevant to what's going on here, but I just don't know if it's true because I don't know if that saying was a saying for them back then. I've looked it up before and it's not clear. So it could be. It sure seems appropriate, but I'm not sure. Then there's the other thing that I like, which is, what are elephants known for? I'll let you think about that for a second while I draw a little picture. Well, elephants are known for being big. And we have some big hills here. Let's see if I can do this. Some big hills. And one thing that people have talked about before is, what do hills have to do with pregnancy or this topic of abortion? Well, a hill is kind of like a little bump, like a little baby bump if someone was pregnant. So maybe that's it. Elephants are pregnant with size, they're big, and maybe this girl is looking at these big hills and thinking about elephants and how big she's going to get when she starts to have a baby, if she does decide to do that. So people have talked about that maybe being a thing, that the hills and why they're like white elephants, what that represents. Now, the bigger ones for me, the ones I like the most, are the ones about the different sides of the hills. I think this is really important, especially when we think about the different sides of the train stations being different choices. They look to one side of the train station to hills, and this is what they see. Let me pull up my story. This is on the first page, which is page 475 as far as the paging goes for your story. And let me read you one of the paragraphs right in the middle of the page there. The woman brought 2 glasses of beer and 2 felt pads. She put the felt pads and the beer glasses on the table and looked at the man and the girl. The girl was looking off at the line of hills. They were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. So she looks to one side and she sees hills that are brown and dry. There's no life there. It's barren. There's nothing growing over there. Now, later in the story, and another thing I asked you to look at were the trees and grain. This is, let me pull it up for me. This is page 477. About in the middle, the girl stood up and walked to the end of the station. Across on the other side were fields of grain and trees along the banks of the Ebro. Far away beyond the river were mountains. So there's 3 things we see here, all of which are similar symbols. We have the trees, the grain, and the river. All of these things are symbols for fertility and life. Trees, obviously, are living things. Grain is always a symbol of fertility because it's from the harvest. It shows that the crops have been fertile. And then rivers are always signs of fertility, or usually are, because wherever there's fresh water flowing, life grows. So she looked at one side, remember, and saw the dry brown hills. That was barrenness, infertility. And the other one is growing life. It has trees, grain, and rivers. So she's having to make a decision between life or kind of like a barren lifelessness. And so when we think about that, going, well, what could a couple, and they're talking about some sort of procedure, they have to choose between new fertile life and maybe more of a barren type of existence. What could that be? And it starts to become more and more like they're thinking about whether or not to have a baby. But when they're talking about having this operation, it makes it sound like maybe she's already pregnant and they're deciding whether or not to keep the baby. I always point this quote out too on page 478. The man is saying, the girl first says, "Doesn't it mean anything to you? We could get along." And he says, "Of course it does, but I don't want anybody but you. I don't want anyone else." And I know it's perfectly simple. So when he says anybody else, sometimes we go like, what? Is he saying like, you're the one for me? I don't want another girlfriend? Or is he saying, I don't want anyone else in the picture, like a kid? So I think that that's kind of a good clue. So I think if you put all that together, you can see what they're talking about. Some students go, wait a minute, Mr. Pjork, she's drinking. She can't be pregnant. Well, I'd say, well, number one, in the 1920s, they would drink when they were pregnant. And still sometimes people do if they do it in moderation. So I don't think that's any reason to think that this isn't the topic they're talking about. Also, some of the ways they describe the operation might not make sense, but I just don't think they might know exactly how an abortion works. So, How are you supposed to figure all that out? Well, this points us to another thing about Hemingway's style. It's sometimes called, has to do with the subtext of what's going on beneath the words that are actually written on the page, trying to read between the lines. We talked about that. Figure out what's going on besides what's implicitly said. And this, here, I'll show you. This is our style sheet. I added some stuff to it. So we have the subtext, but under that I have the theory of omission. To omit something is to leave it out. So this means to leave out some of the details because there's some stuff he thinks we can figure out on our own. This is also sometimes called the iceberg theory for Hemingway. And this is how it works. You know how icebergs work. You see just a tiny bit of it above the water, but then the rest of it's underneath and you can't see it. So this tiny bit is, I have here, what is directly stated in the text, what you can actually read the words of. But down here is the meaning we as readers are supposed to understand or supposed to, what does it say? Must figure out. Hemingway liked that. He didn't think he should just spell everything out for us. He thought he should give us enough to kind of figure things out, and also not put in too much stuff that would ruin the flow and rhythm of kind of the poetic style he had, and then leave us to figure it out. So that's called the theory of omission, or the iceberg theory. Also, I put imagism. We're going to learn a little bit about imagism later. This was a movement in poetry, really driven by the poet Ezra Pound in the 1920s. He was a huge influence on Hemingway. They were buddies. They hung out in France. And he was all about just, in poetry, giving a picture of an image and then letting the reader kind of take that for what it meant without explaining it at all. So we see that a little bit in Hemingway's writing. You see in a lot of modernists. It's to a certain degree in Fitzgerald and even Faulkner as well. So one thing you would have noticed about this story in closing also is that it still had that spare plain language. Wasn't hard to read, probably wasn't very difficult, didn't take you very long. And also a big thing in this one is repetition. Remember the repetition? Listen to this passage. It is pretty funny. On the second page, page 476, we have this. Very top. The man called, "Listen," through the curtain. The woman came out from the bar. "$4. We want 2 anise del Toro. With water? Do you want it with water?" "I don't know," the girl said. "Is it good with water?" "It's all right. You want them with water?" asked the woman. "Yes, with water." With water, with water, with water, with water. So you see that repetition. Here, it's not in somebody's thought, but it's in the dialogue. But you can see he likes to get these swirls of repetition. Part of it is the poetic flow of it, but also is that little bit of that suggestion of stream of consciousness, even in people's interactions. One last thing that I like to point out on this story before I close is this idea of the theory of omission, of leaving things out. Let me read this and see if you can take a second to understand what he has left out. So, same section that was so repetitive. "Do you want it with water?" "I don't know," the girl said. "Is it good with water?" "It's all right." "You want them with water?" asked the woman. "Yes, with water. It tastes like licorice," the girl said, and put the glass down. What was just left out there? I'll give you a second. Okay. She said, "Do you want them with water?" "Yes, with water." Then immediately she was drinking the drink and talking about how it tastes like licorice. It would take several minutes at least for the woman to go, the person at the bar to go get the drinks, make them, then bring them back. But he cuts all of that out. We know that they went and got the drinks. He doesn't feel like he needs to let that interrupt his dialogue between them. So he's omitting a lot of stuff that we just have to figure out is gone, and we keep going. So that's another thing about Hemingway's style. Sometimes he would take a draft and just start slashing stuff and figuring out what he could get away with leaving out. So that's part of his minimalist style, that iceberg theory, letting the subtext do the talking. All right, so I hope you guys have a good weekend. I hope this is helping you understand Hemingway a bit more and understanding the stories. We'll try to get these videos a little bit more jazzed up. I know my wife is going to help me with maybe some cool lighting for some good YouTube production. But for right now, I just wanted to get some information to you. Hope you're doing well. We'll get through all this. You'll be good. And I will write to you and talk to you next week. Have a good weekend.